On the morning of May 31st, 1889, 20 million tons of water came down the Conemaugh Valley at 40 miles per hour. It had been raining for 2 days in western Pennsylvania. The South Fork Dam, which held back a private lake 14 miles above the town of Johnstown, had been weakening for years. Engineers had warned about it. Local residents had warned about it. The dam's owners had been warned about it by a steel executive named Daniel Morrell, who made repeated requests that it be strengthened. The first president of the South Fork Club, the private retreat that owned the lake, responded to Morrell's concerns with 8 words: "You and your people are in no danger from our enterprise." At 3:10 in the afternoon, the dam failed. The wall of water took 16 minutes to reach Johnstown. By the time it arrived, it had collected houses, railroad cars, trees, livestock, and the bodies of people swept up from smaller towns in the valley. 2,209 people died. The New York World headline read, "The club is guilty." The Chicago Herald asked, "Manslaughter or murder?" Among the members of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were some of the wealthiest men in America. Andrew Carnegie was one of them. Henry Clay Frick was another. No one went to prison. No one paid $1 in damages. 3 years later, the same men were involved in an event that killed more workers on American soil. This is the story of a man who started with nothing and built the greatest industrial empire of the 19th century. It is also the story of what that empire cost. Chapter 1. The Bobbin Boy from Dunfermline. Andrew Carnegie was born on November 25, 1835, in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a one-room weaver's cottage where his family cooked, ate, and slept. His father, William, ran a small handloom weaving shop. His mother, Margaret, mended shoes and ran a small grocery to supplement the family income. When the Industrial Revolution reached Scotland in the 1840s, mechanized steam looms eliminated the trade that William Carnegie had built his life around. The family had nothing. Margaret Carnegie made the decision they would go to America. In 1848, Andrew Carnegie was 13 years old when his family crossed the Atlantic and settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh. The crossing was 50 days of crowded bunks and minimal food. When they arrived, Andrew immediately went to work in a cotton factory as a bobbin boy, earning $1.20 for a 70-hour week. He could not afford school. He taught himself by reading everything he could find. A local businessman named Colonel James Anderson opened his private library to working boys on Saturday evenings, and Carnegie was there every week. Decades later, he would remember Colonel Anderson when he decided how to spend his fortune. By 1849, he had moved from the cotton factory to a job as a messenger at the Ohio Telegraph Company, earning $2 a week. He taught himself to read telegraph messages by sound rather than by paper, a skill so rare that the railroad executive Thomas Scott noticed him and hired him as a personal secretary and telegraph operator. Scott became Carnegie's mentor. He taught him to invest. He showed him how money made money. Carnegie invested in sleeping car manufacturers, in oil, in iron bridges. By 1863, half of his income came from investments rather than salary. He was 28 years old. He had arrived in America with nothing 15 years earlier. He was already a wealthy man. He was also just getting started. Chapter 2. The Steel Empire. Carnegie understood something about the American economy in the second half of the 19th century that most of his contemporaries grasped only partially. The country needed steel. Railroads needed steel rails. Cities needed steel beams for the buildings rising floor by floor above their streets. Ships needed steel hulls. Bridges needed steel spans. The demand was not going to diminish. It was going to accelerate. He also understood a specific technology. The Bessemer process, developed in the 1850s, allowed steel to be produced faster and cheaper than any previous method. Most manufacturers were slow to adopt it. Carnegie saw it as the foundation of an empire. In the early 1870s, he co-founded his first steel company near Pittsburgh. He built the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, named after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a man who would need enormous quantities of steel and who Carnegie was not shy about flattering. His competitive advantage was not simply technology, it was structure. While other manufacturers bought raw materials, made steel, and sold it, Carnegie owned the entire chain. He owned coal mines to fuel the furnaces. He owned the iron ore deposits in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. He owned the ships and railroads that transported the ore to his mills. He owned the mills where the ore became steel. He owned the systems that delivered the steel to buyers. Every step that a competitor paid to an outside supplier, Carnegie kept inside his own operation. Every dollar that leaked out of a conventional manufacturer's process stayed inside Carnegie Steel. He used economic downturns as weapons. During the Depression of 1873, while other manufacturers retrenched, Carnegie built. Labor was cheap, materials were cheap, construction costs were minimal. When the economy recovered, he had more capacity than anyone else and could produce steel at costs his competitors could not match. By 1892, his primary holdings were consolidated into the Carnegie Steel Company. It was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. Carnegie called himself a champion of the working man. He wrote essays about the obligations of wealth. He expressed public support for labor unions. He said publicly that no mill was worth a single drop of blood. Then came Homestead. Chapter 3. Fort Frick. Carnegie Steel's Homestead Mill sat on the south bank of the Monongahela River near Pittsburgh, employing approximately 3,800 workers. In the summer of 1892, the contract between Carnegie Steel and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was about to expire. Henry Clay Frick was the chairman of Carnegie Steel. Carnegie had placed him there in 1889 because Frick was the most effective cost-cutter in the American steel industry. He was also, by the testimony of nearly everyone who dealt with him, completely indifferent to human consequences when they conflicted with operational efficiency. Carnegie spent the spring of 1892 in Scotland, at a remote fishing lodge. He left Frick in charge with instructions that amounted to authorization for whatever Frick decided was necessary. His cables made this explicit: "We approve of anything you do." Frick opened negotiations with the union in February of 1892. The company demanded a 22% wage cut for nearly half the union's membership. The union refused. Frick fired all 3,800 workers on July 2nd. He then built a 10-foot fence topped with barbed wire around the entire Homestead Mill. Workers called it Fort Frick. On the night of July 5th, 300 Pinkerton agents assembled at a staging point on the Ohio River. They had been hired by Frick as private security guards. Many of them were recruited from lodging houses and did not know what their assignment was until they were already on barges heading upriver. They had been given Winchester rifles. They had been given badges that read Watchman, Carnegie Company, Limited. At 2:30 in the morning on July 6th, the plant whistle at Homestead blew. Thousands of workers and their families flooded to the riverbank, and the Pinkerton barges came into range. Gunfire began. Who fired first was disputed then and has never been definitively settled. What is not disputed is what happened next. The battle lasted 13 hours. 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton agents were killed. Dozens more were wounded on both sides. The Pinkertons raised a white flag by early evening. They surrendered. As they came ashore, the crowd beat them. Workers set the barges on fire. Frick requested that the governor of Pennsylvania send the state militia. 8,500 National Guard troops arrived and occupied the town. The mill reopened with strikebreakers. By November, the Union had collapsed. Carnegie and Scotland throughout the entire confrontation later claimed to have been appalled by the violence. His cables to Frick said otherwise. His public image as a friend of labor was destroyed. The wage cuts that Frick had demanded were implemented. By 1897, daily wages of skilled workers at Homestead had fallen by a fifth from their pre-strike levels. Work shifts had increased from 8 hours to 12. Carnegie Steel's profits in the 9 years after Homestead reached $106 million. Chapter 4. The Gospel and the Gap. In 1889, the same year the South Fork Dam killed 2,200 people in Johnstown, Andrew Carnegie published an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. Its central argument was simple. The wealthy had an obligation to use their fortunes for the public good during their lifetimes. Hoarding wealth was a failure of character. The man who dies rich, Carnegie wrote, dies disgraced. The essay made Carnegie one of the most discussed public intellectuals in the English-speaking world. It was admired, debated, cited, and praised. It also raised a question that Carnegie spent the rest of his life navigating and never fully answered. What was the relationship between how the money was made and what it was used for afterward? Carnegie's workers labored 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, in mills that were noisy, dangerous, and suffocating with heat. Accidents were regular. Fatalities were not unusual. The wage scales that Frick implemented after Homestead ensured that the people producing Carnegie's wealth received as little of it as possible. The libraries Carnegie built were magnificent. He eventually funded 2,509 of them across the United States, Canada, Britain, and beyond. The first was in his hometown of Dunfermline, Scotland. Carnegie Hall opened in New York City in 1891. He funded Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. The Carnegie Corporation of New York received $125 million. By the time of his death in 1919, he had given away approximately $350 million, roughly 90% of his fortune. The critics noted the sequence. He had accumulated the fortune through labor practices that his own public statements condemned. He had then given the money away to institutions that bore his name. A library, Med, after a man who destroyed his workers' union, was still a library. It was also still named after the man who destroyed the union. Carnegie himself acknowledged Homestead as the great regret of his life. He wrote privately that the events of July 1892 had wounded him deeply. He expressed guilt about what Frick had done in his name with his authorization. He and Frick eventually severed their relationship entirely, partly over the Homestead aftermath, and partly over a financial dispute in which the two men spent years in litigation. The guilt did not change the wages. The libraries did not reverse the blacklisting of the 300 Homestead workers who never worked in the steel industry again. Chapter 5. The Sale and the Silence. In early 1901, J.P. Morgan approached Carnegie with an offer to buy Carnegie Steel Company. Morgan was assembling the components of what would become United States Steel, the first corporation in American history to be capitalized at over $1 billion. He needed Carnegie's operation to make it work. Carnegie was 65 years old. He had been building for 30 years. He was ready to stop. The final price was $480 million. Carnegie received his payment in gold bonds. The transaction made him the wealthiest man in the world. Morgan famously extended his hand after the deal was signed and said, "I want to congratulate you, Mr. Carnegie, on being the richest man in the world." Carnegie spent the remaining 18 years of his life giving it away as fast as he could. He gave to universities and scientific institutions. He gave to peace organizations. He funded the construction of church organs across the English-speaking world, more than 7,000 of them. He established the Carnegie Corporation. He built the Peace Palace at The Hague. He wrote, lectured, and corresponded ceaselessly about the obligation of wealth. He died on August 11, 1919, at Shadowbrook, his estate in Lenox, Massachusetts. He was 83 years old. He was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York. His daughter Margaret, born in 1897, lived until 1990. She was the last direct descendant to carry the Carnegie name in any meaningful public sense. The family had no dynasty in the way that the Rockefellers or the Mellons built dynasties. Carnegie had devoted himself so completely to philanthropy that the institutions he created outlived his family by a century. The Carnegie Corporation still operates today. Carnegie Mellon University has more than 14,000 students. 2,500 libraries in the English-speaking world trace their existence to a boy who could not afford school in Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Chapter 6. What the Empire Was Worth. Andrew Carnegie's steel company produced more steel in 1900 than all of Great Britain. It employed tens of thousands of workers who built the physical infrastructure of modern America. Every major bridge, every skyscraper, every railroad line of the Gilded Age era ran on Carnegie steel. The workers who produced it labored under conditions that their employer in his published essays said he opposed. The dam that killed 2,200 people in Johnstown was a pleasure retreat for the men who ran the steel industry. The strike that destroyed the Homestead Union was authorized by the man who wrote The Gospel of Wealth. These contradictions do not cancel each other out. They define each other. Carnegie was not a hypocrite in the simple sense of believing one thing and doing another. He believed in his own rhetoric about obligation and service and the responsibility of wealth. He also believed that his steel empire needed to function efficiently, that labor costs needed to be controlled, that unions interfered with productivity, and that Henry Clay Frick was the right man to ensure all of the above. Both things were true simultaneously. The gospel of wealth was genuine. Homestead was also genuine. What Carnegie understood better than most of his contemporaries was that neither truth canceled the other. A man could build libraries with money extracted from workers who could not afford books. A man could fund universities for the children of laborers whose own parents he had driven into poverty. A man could write about the disgrace of dying rich while ensuring that the people who made him rich stayed poor. This is not a story that resolves. The workers who built the empire are not named in the institutions that survived it. The people who died in Johnstown are not commemorated on the walls of Carnegie Hall. The home. Stead workers who were blacklisted for life do not appear in the scholarship funds that Carnegie endowed. The bobbin boy from Dunfermline who crossed the Atlantic with nothing became the richest man in the world by a method that his own philosophy condemned. Then he gave almost all of it away. Both of those sentences are true. The distance between them is where the dark story lives.